Welcome to our last election panel in SETA. SETA panel titled on what should we expect from the outcome of coming elections, which is just a week away, I should say. This is not the first time we are having our speakers here. Mr. Ali Akarca has presented several times his forecasts about the elections in the previous years. More or less, he was right and accurate. Mr. Ibrahim Uslu, he is a well-known pollster in Turkey, and he is also known with his accurate election results, especially, I believe, in 2002. Right? No, the first, let's say, the well-known figure came in 2002, and Mr. Ibrahim Dalmış, political psychologist, he is also very well known about his poll research and accurate forecasting. Today we are going to have three speakers. They will present their papers in 15 minutes, each of them. And first we'll start with Mr. Ali Akarca. His paper is an academic one. He has a model. He's going to present it. So far it worked. But at the end of the day, it's forecast, and he's going to explain what are the ups and downs in his model, weakness and strong part. I'm not going to extend too much. I just would like to have Mr. Ali Akarca to have his presentation. After that, we'll have a QA session, and we'll finish the panel.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming to listen to us. And I would like to thank SETA for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk to you about a model. In fact, I'm going to first try to explain to you a field called economic voting. During the last 40 years, a field has developed trying to understand the voter behavior. Now, I won't go into the details of it, but if you want to understand the longevity of governments or how frequently elections are called, the policies the governments follow, why do they do that, they are all related to voter behavior. So there is a great interest in understanding voter behavior, not just to predict the results, but to understand government policies and politicians' behaviors. Now, this field I'm talking about, one study defines it as a field that mixes economics and political science through econometrics. So that's what I'll be doing here. Now, first of all, I want to give you the key factors in a typical election which affects the results. Okay? I'll just try to give you a little bit of theory on that, and then I will try to apply to the case at hand. The case, the 2014 elections. And then everybody's interested in the recent events, and how they would affect. Once we understand the channels through which these effects work, then maybe we can speculate on possible effects these may have. I grouped determinants that are mentioned in the literature that affect the election outcome. I'll explain each one individually, but let me list them. Political alignment, strategic voting, cost of ruling, or sometimes they call it depreciation in the political capital, incumbency advantage, economic performance, and political realignment. The last one is particular to Turkey. Most countries do not experience that. People do not change sides very often, and it doesn't happen in Turkey very often. It happened in the 50s, and the next time, half a century later, as you know, between 2002 and 2011, a number of parties which ruled the country disappeared. True Path Party, Motherland Party, Democratic Left Party, Young Party, these all disappeared during that period. So we have to take that into account. Something similar to this happened in Italy in 1994 after clean hands operation. So the number of cases are very limited in the world. Okay? Now, what is political alignment? Voters usually pick a party which they think represents their economic interests and their worldview, their ideology. okay? And then they stick with them. Of course, what determines somebody's political view and their economic interest, their location, their age, their sex, their education, you know, what kind of industry they are in, and so on. And these do not change from one election to another that much. So usually, most voters vote for the same party they voted for in the previous election. So it will be reasonable, if you are making a prediction or analysis, it is very reasonable to start with the party's vote in the previous election. Of course, then you have to make some adjustments, okay? Now, what are adjustments? One of them is strategic voting. Now, not all voters, but significant number of them vote strategically. What does that mean? That means they don't vote for their first choice. They vote for their second, even third choice. Now, why do they do that? Well, there are mainly two reasons. Number one, there's a tendency among some of the supporters of the incumbent parties to balance them, to create checks and balances. That's nothing particular to the Turkish case. It is the same in other countries. Now, this is even more so in local elections in Turkey, because in local elections, the electorate gets a chance to give a signal or warning to the ruling party without toppling it. You know, they get that chance, okay? Now, the second reason is the 10% threshold used in parliamentary elections. So in parliamentary elections, small party supporters, people whose first choice is small parties, they vote for larger parties. For example, in the local election, they may prefer Felicity Party, Saadet Party, but in the general election, they may vote for Justice and Development Party, AK Party, right? Now, if you look at the statistics, I mean, you don't have to be a statistician, just look at the plain statistics, the average vote, or typically, Felicity Party gets about 1 or 2% of the vote in general elections. But in local elections, they get about 4 to 5%. That's an example of strategic voting. Okay? Of course, you can do the same thing with Democratic Left Party and Republican People's Party and so on. So the threshold causes people in the local elections to return back to their first choices. So the incumbent party is expected to lose some votes in local elections. Now, similar thing happens in the United States. Let me give you some examples so you don't think this is particular to Turkish voter. As you know, in the United States, there is presidential elections every 4 years, but election for Congress is every 2 years. So in the middle of the presidential term, what they call midterm election, there is a congressional election falling in the middle of the presidential term. In that election, during the last 150 years, with 2 exceptions, every time the party in White House loses votes, okay? Their vote share goes down. Now, in European Union countries, there is election for European Parliament. The incumbent parties, the countries ruling the country, domestically ruling the country, they get fewer votes in European Parliament elections. So this is a tool in the hands of the voters to send a signal to the incumbent party. So strategic voting is quite important. Now, there is cost of ruling, okay? If you are running a country, it's inevitable that you have to make decisions, and it's inevitable that some of those decisions are going to be not liked by some of your supporters, you know, so then they may get angry at you. So the longer time you remain in power, the more concessions you make, more decisions you make, and more disappointments you create, so you lose some of your political, and you can make mistakes, honest mistakes, and you may make compromises that your supporters don't like. So there is a decay in the vote share of the incumbent party during the time they are in power. As the time increases, the cost of ruling increases. On the other hand, incumbent party has advantages. You know, they can be heard on the media. You know, they can decide where the investments go, where the transfer payments are going to be made, their timing, right? So as a result, they can get some advantage. They can draw members of other parties to themselves by offering social services, by building roads, by public works, and so on, or making transfer payments. Now, economic performance. Well, economic performance, that's why the name economic voting was given, because the main idea behind it is to see the effect of economy while you control the other factors. Now, voters reward incumbent parties for good economic performance and penalize them for bad ones. Now, here, in my case, I took growth rate per capita, GDP, gross domestic product per capita though. Growth rate in that is one indication, and inflation rate is another indication. If you want to get more detailed, it's an implicit price deflator of GDP as the measure of inflation. So they look at these things. However, the voters are backward-looking more than forward-looking. And when they are backward-looking, they are myopic. They look only during the performance during the last year. In fact, many people talk about session economics, election economics. In economics, we call it political business cycles. And people blame the politicians for that. Well, the voters' behavior encourages parties to do that. Now, it has not been done during the last 10 years or so under Justice and Development Party, but because they are almost guaranteed to win, so they were never in danger of losing power. But in the 90s, when you could get the power by 3-4 percentage difference, that was used extensively. So if it ever comes to a level that it may affect the outcome of the government, then parties may start using that. The potential is there, that's what I'm saying. So voters look past and they are myopic. And another important point, very important, I'll show you the results, not only in Turkey, but in the United States and other countries too. Voters give more weight to growth than inflation. The weight of growth is 6 times that of inflation. So what does that mean? As long as you create 1% growth, stimulate the economy, as long as it does not create more than 6-7% inflation, that can bring you still votes. In fact, inflation effect is usually seen afterwards, you know. And then after the election, you can put the brakes on and political business cycles emerge. So it has enormous implications, these facts I'm telling you. Oh boy, I'm behind. Well, then I will shortcut this part, political realignment. Well, I don't have to tell this crowd what has happened. I was going to explain the reasons behind it. At the very beginning, I said there is a tendency on the voters to vote for parties which they think represents their benefits and their ideology. However, under 3 cases, they change sides. That happens rarely, but if the parties change in a manner that doesn't represent their benefits or ideology anymore, like that's what happened to True Path Party, let's say, then the voters find another party. Another one is the voters change, but their parties remain the same. For example, party supports agricultural programs, but the constituency moved to the cities and they have different problems. That can happen. And if they're involved in chronic corruption and incompetence for a long time, then that can happen. That's what happened in 2002. I'll get back to that if you want me to. Now, all of these variables are put into an equation. I don't have time to explain the technical details, unfortunately. But if you want to come later, all these variables, all these factors I mentioned are in the model, and it examines all elections, Senate, by-elections, local elections, parliamentary elections since 1950. And here there are the results. Again, I'm going to skip over, except to say that for those of you who are familiar with econometrics, all parameters come out significant, statistically, highly significant. In other words, the data fits the model quite well, okay? Now, the empirical result is incumbency advantage is 6.7% of the total vote, okay? Now, in this election, because it's local election, 16.8% of Justice and Development Party supporters are supposed to go to other parties, okay? Not the total vote, just that party's vote. And cost of ruling costs 5.9% of its supporters per year, and economic growth, each percentage economic growth gives 0.80% of the total vote, and inflation 0.12%, and the political alignment between 2002 and 2011, approximately every election gave about 18% of the vote from other right-wing parties to Justice and Development Party. Now, if you put all of these together, okay, if you put all of these together, like strategic voting would cost you typical 5.53, and then if it's a local election, I'm using the parameters from the model estimated. So how many minutes I have? Well, anyway, it comes to 44.93%. If you take all of these factors into account, I mentioned, and if you want a 95% confidence interval, if you want an interval estimate, not a point estimate, it's like 41.99, let's say 42% to 48%. Now, this assumes recent events did not have abnormal effects. In other words, when we say cost of ruling, it includes in every election there is accusations of corruption, there are accusations of impropriety, dictatorship, whatever. If they have anything over and about that, this model serves as a tool to, after the election, to judge the results. For example, if the Justice and Development Party vote goes down by 5%, that is what you would expect, because economic conditions, if they were same as 2011, the prediction I gave you would be about 3.5 points higher, okay? And if the election was parliamentary election, the vote share of the party, incumbent party, would be 2.84% higher. In other words, 5% drop can be explained simply by this being local election and this being economic conditions not being as good as in 2011. It's good, but not as good, okay? And if the realignment stopped last election, that would be also another 3 points, okay? Now, if the losses are more than that, if it dropped below 42%, then that will be abnormal. However, the strategic voting can go in either direction. For example, in 2007, the voters, instead of supporting, going against the Justice and Development Party or the incumbent party to balance, create checks and balances, they went from other parties to that party to balance forces outside democratic forces, like military was trying to maybe threaten with coup, and just constitutional court was threatening to close the party. So under those conditions, a lot of voters said we are not supposed to put the weight against the incumbent party. In this case, we have to come to the support of the incumbent party. So the recent events may have that effect too. Well, I guess I'm out of time, right? Well, I won't go into these then. Yeah, you know, so, well, you know, here I have later, oops. You know, in case you are wondering where the votes will go if they leave the Justice and Development Party, I can talk about that too, but I won't do that now in the question part. Let's go to the, yeah, let me do it. Bir dakika, toplayacağım. Şöyle diyeyim, let me say you this way. If historical patterns continue, historical patterns since 1950, and if the recent events have effects, but not extraordinary effects, no more effects than the previous similar cases, we would expect a 5% drop in the incumbent party's vote, okay? Or if you want to take an interval estimate rather than point estimate, it can drop as much as 42%, or it may be 48%, okay? If the upcoming election was parliamentary election, and if the economic conditions were same as 2011, there will be no drop predicted, okay? And depending upon the outcome, in fact, the model would be more useful after the election to judge, to interpret the results. So that's, now, I want to also emphasize this. I am not here to tell you this is the way to predict election results. These two gentlemen are in a better position to predict the election than me. You know, I'm just interested in explaining, not just predicting. I'm trying to, my primary goal is to explain, and the secondary goal is, after the election, how do we interpret, if the votes go up or down, how do we interpret that? This provides a yardstick by which we can compare election outcomes, whereas they go and talk to the people right now, so that's more accurate. So I'm not challenging poll takers. I'm just saying this is an alternative and may provide some other explanation. Okay. Thank you for listening to me.
İbrahim'in yerine oturursanız hocam.
Olur.
Şey yapalım oraya. Thank you, Professor. I don't know, I mean, your model is alternative or not, but we'll see by human counting how these statistics being answered in Mr. Ibrahim Uslu's presentation, because this is real time, real people, pollster. You ask questions and you get answers, not only related with economic issues, but rather all kinds of psychological, sociological and political issues. Please. Şey geliyor hocam. Sen sunuşu açarsan.
Hello, everyone. I'll be speaking in Turkish, so the ones who are wearing their headphones will take them off and the others will put them on. So, back to after 2011 elections. But the studies that you do before elections are just estimates. What you do after the elections have tangible data at the basis, because you ask the voters this time not how they will behave, but how they have behaved at the poll, at the ballot box. So, characteristics of voters for 2011 elections. The loyalty of the voters is shown on the screen. 71.5% of all the voters have voted for the same party that they have voted in the previous election. So this means multiple votes for multiple times for the same party. Those are the ones we call loyal voters. So the red section shows those voters. And considering the two elections, the amount of voters who have voted for different parties, who have changed their parties or the direction of their votes, is 19.1. It's not a big number, but it shows us, this graphic, it shows us that most of the parties in Turkey, most of the voters in Turkey are loyal voters. For example, when Abdullah Öcalan was caught, MHP's or DSP's votes have risen, but only until 20-something, not to a level of 40%, 45% that could have an impact, that could have had an impact on the elections. But that happened after the economic crisis in 2001, which actually started with the political turmoil in late 90s. And the economic crisis came in 2001, and almost all of the voters have changed their alignment, so to speak, and they have voted for a different party this time. But most of the voters do not change their parties easily. We are speaking about 2011, elections of 2011, and let me remind you that AKP got 49% of the votes. 80% of those voters are loyal parties, which means 80% of those voters have been voting for AKP already. And also, the party has earned other votes. Between 2007 and 2011, AKP hadn't lost a lot of voters. CHP, again, the Republican People's Party, has most of its voters who are loyal voters, and you can see other parties, other numbers as well. So the first thing we can say about the Turkish electorate, they are loyal to their parties. They don't realign themselves often and quickly. How about demographics and related factors, how they can help us in terms of estimating or forecasting the voters' direction? You see the sexes or the gender. On the leftmost column it says gender, women, men, and total. This is women voters, this line, and the parties that women electorate vote for. 47.3% of all the women voters vote for AKP, and 25.3% vote for CHP. And the total of the votes for AKP is 43.6. You see that for women it is about the average. Okay, let me show you with the mouse. So for women, 47.3, that's well above the Turkish average, and the same thing goes for the CHP as well. But when you move on with MHP and BDP, more radical parties they are, women's rate of voting, that's lower than the Turkish average. Women vote for MHP and BDP less, and they vote for AKP and CHP more. So gender is a factor which helps us in terms of defining the behaviors of voters in Turkey. And this is a slide about the age group. You can see the age groups here, 18 to 24, 25, 34, etc. And to which parties they have voted and the percentages. So the average vote for AKP was, remember, 43.6% all over Turkey. For the age group 18 to 24, AKP, AK Party, is below its own average. So this graph shows us, or this table shows us, that AKP gets most of its votes from the age group 25 to 44. And the same thing, almost a similar pattern goes for CHP and MHP and BDP. You see that mostly young people vote for them. For example, the average of votes for MHP is 11.3, and from the age group 18 to 24, it gets 13.1% of votes. The same thing goes for Peace and Democracy Party, BDP, as well. So we can use the age groups as a factor for forecasting the behaviors of voters. And this is the graph table about education, the level of education. If, for example, only undergrad and graduates would be voting, the ruling party would be CHP. You see, the undergraduate level vote for AKP by 27.9%, and the same number is 31.6% for CHP, and it is well above the average, CHP average for Turkey. The same thing goes for graduates as well. They vote mostly for CHP, but when the education level goes down, the vote share of AKP rises, and it is well above the Turkey average. And this shows us the impact of the education variable on the voters' behavior in Turkey. There are some significant factors on this table as well. Then this slide is about professions. For example, salary workers vote less than the Turkey average for AKP. For example, who work in family businesses without salaries vote mostly for AKP. And when you look at CHP, the salary workers vote more than the average, Turkey average, to CHP. But when you move towards farmers, family workers, or seasonal workers as such, you see CHP gets less votes from these sections of the society. And also CHP focuses on the Republican voters. Those are the educated ones, or the people with higher level of education, higher level of income. And this is the pension fund, for example. Let me explain this to you, foreign friends. It's a pension fund covering the civil servants. The Turkey average for AKP is 43.6, and only 32.4 of that comes from the pension fund subscribers, but that number is higher for CHP. So if only the pension fund receivers or recipients would be voting in Turkey in the general election, CHP again would be the governing party. So profession is also another variable or another factor which explains or helps us explain the voter behavior. This was one of the theories, demographics, used for explaining voter behavior, and then you have politics. Again, we have carried out this study after 2011 elections. You have two prominent factors: the leader of the party, which considered that it is important by 81.4%, and the political view or the ideology of the party. Those are the two significant factors that impact the voter behavior higher than 81%. So let's break it down to parties, existing parties in Turkey. The incumbent party is the party in which the leader is the most important. 88.3, almost 90% of all the voters of AKP vote for AKP just because of its leader. The same number goes down to 81.6% and to 76.4% for MHP. How about the political view, political ideology of the party? How important is that? Well, it is the most important in CHP. CHP is a central party actually, but it is an ideological party, a party of ideology, because its voters vote for CHP for its ideology. And the AKP is the party in which the ideology of the party is secondary to its leader. And then we have the campaigns, election campaigns ongoing, actually just stopped. And there are many activities and research carried out about the impact of the campaigns on behavior of the voters, leadership, ideology, and when you compare those with campaign activities are of lesser significance. So after this long introduction, now let's come to our predictions about March 30th. 1. March 30th. It is no longer a local election. The electorate considered this no longer as a local election because, you might ask why, because the real votes for 2009 and the real votes in 2011, you see it on the screen, for parties, and for all of the parties there are differences, big differences between the votes. All of the parties, their local election votes and the general election votes were so different. In early February we have carried out a study, and in the same study we have asked questions as to which parties people will be voting in the local and in the general elections. But this is early February, and still the general elections and local elections, the numbers pertaining thereto are different. And this is the result of a study which was completed only yesterday. And on the rightmost column you see our estimates or forecasts for the local elections as well. If elections would take place today, the general elections would take place today, AKP would receive 47.5%. And our expectation for the local elections for AKP is 46.8%. So the two numbers are so close. The same thing goes for CHP. For general elections, CHP has 26.7%. For local elections, it has slightly about 27%. The same for MHP and the others. It's just a 0.5 difference for MHP, and even a lesser difference for BDP HDP. For the general elections, we estimate some 7.1% for BDP and 7.5% for the local elections. And others, the last line, Felicity Party, DSP, for example, Democratic Leftist Party, other parties, total is around, for general elections, 3.2%, and for local elections, it's around 3.4%. So the voters have almost chosen their sides, and they will behave. This table shows us that voters will behave as if the upcoming local elections are no different than general elections. The loyalty of the voters is on the rise. This was the table we have just seen. In 2011, if you remember, the share of loyalty of voters for AKP was 79, and here this table shows us on the gray areas, you see on green cells, the numbers have gone up since 2011. Amount of local voters of AKP are slightly higher than 80%, and the same numbers for other parties are shown in gray cells. So AKP voters' loyalty is on the rise. There is a polarization between the voters of different parties. The voters are going back to home, let's say, to their home parties, and people will be changing their or realigning themselves between parties less in this elections. Okay, no need for this slide maybe, but this is my last slide, and we think about the elections that's upcoming in 30th of March. There is a campaign, an anti-government campaign since 17th of December, the graft probe, etc. The AKP voters are not affected by this, not at all. And why do we think so? After 17th of December, some allegations have been set forth, and we have measured them one by one, and we have received what we have asked the voters what they think about that. The voters believe whatever the party says about what's going on. That's one thing we have observed. For example, about 17th of December, when you say, when AKP voters argue, or the party argues that it is a battle against, or it's an operation against the AKP, the voters believe that. And many of the opposition voters believe that it is just an operation against the grafts of the party. So these arguments hold water or not, depending on the stance of the voters. And also there is a political polarization, as I've said during my presentation, and we are discussing whether or not there are floating voters. Well, our observation shows us the polarization is the AKP, and on the other side you have the others. And no floating voters between the two. Voters do not shift from AKP to the other's side or vice versa. And others cover, of course, MHP, BDP to some extent, and CHP mostly. But between these parties, among the others themselves, there are floating voters, yes, but not between AKP. In larger cities, for example, there are floating voters between CHP and MHP, but there are two poles, AKP and the others, and no movement in between. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's have a historical background where Mr. Ibrahim Dalmış goes back to Turkish voters' behavior history, I should say, and the picture after their decisions. I believe he'll go back maybe till 1960s, and he'll come back to here, and how political identities formed and deformed and changed.
Herkese iyi günler. Şimdi hocamın modeli.
Hello to you all. The professor explained his model, and Ibrahim also made an explanation and a presentation about the estimates regarding the results of the election. And I will try to draw some conclusions from the previous elections and the historic trends in the behavior of the constituency. So maybe we should accept something at the very beginning, and it will be easier to understand what I will explain you in a minute.
Şimdi Türkiye'de
in Turkey, politics in the modern sense that we understand started in Turkey, and two groups were formed. through the political movements. It is very hard to give them certain names, but of course, just as a label, we're going to be naming them. One of them was the centralists, secularists, and a principle of secularism was taken as basis, and it was very important for them. The Western values were put in the foreground, and it was advocating freedom in the social spheres. It may permit everything, it may allow everything almost, but it is more conservative in the economic sphere. It's an institution, it's a group like that one. And this group is called the leftists, as I call them. İdris Küçükömer, for example, and different sociologists give them different names, but this is a secularist group which advocates the Western values. The other group is conservative in the social sphere, however, it is liberal in the economic fields. And with regard to secularism, they are Democrats in their position, and these people are called the rightist people. Under normal conditions, these two groups are formed. And they do not dwell on this as an intellectual, a hobby only, and they behave like a social category. But they, of course, represent certain social categories. For example, their opposition was not very intellectual, and they could have some struggles and fights in between. During the War of Independence, they come together, but it was very short-lived. I will be talking about these parties that are shown on the slide in a minute. But the formation and the establishment of the parties is a bit interesting as well. The Unionists, İttihat Terakki, in other words, was transformed into the first group in the parliament. Then it was transformed into CHP, the Republican People's Party.
Liderliğini yaptığı bu Osmanlı
Prince Sabahattin was leading this in the Ottoman period, and they were the second group in the parliament. And they become the opposition later on. So this opposition was very much having difficulty in stepping on the stage of politics. And the second group is a Progressive Republican Party. So it was very short-lived as well. But Kazım Karabekir, Rauf Orbay, Ali Fuat Cebesoy, Refet Beyla, Adnan Adbay, all of them were the founders of the party. And these people were also in the group of founders. However, they were feeling themselves closer to this group in terms of their ideology. Maybe they were in love with being a leader, and that's how they could criticize CHP. That's why they're advocating for this group. And after a very short period of time, the Şehzait and the assassination on Izmir, and because of all of these, this was closed down. In 1930s, we see the Freedom Party, and it was established on instruction to Fethi Okyar, and they are advocating opposite theories. However, the founders are not coming from the other category. And after 6 months, it was shut down as well. And at the very end, Celal Bayar, Adnan Menderes, Fuat Körpülü, and Refik Kualtan, the quartet, in other words, did separate from the CHP, and they established the Democrat Party. And the opposition theories were advocated by the elitist group, or some people from the elitist group. And then the multi-party life in Turkish political scene is started. Of course, there were some interruptions during this long period of time. You can see them on the screen as well. In the 1950s, the rightist people were represented by DP and left was represented by CHP. During 90s, DP was shut down and it was replaced by the Justice Party. And there was a dual trial there, and there was a New Turkey Party, but the Justice Party was the prevailing party, and New Turkey Party, right after the election, weakened. And then they were representing the rightist wing, and CHP was representing the leftist group. In 1948, from the Democrat Party, a group of people, a group of MB or a group of founders from the were protesting the approximation between Justice Party and CHP, and they separated from this party and they established the Nation Party. And the Villager Nation Party was the transformation of that party, and it received a lot of votes in the 1960s. Then it was transformed into MHP, and the Nation Party separated from that again, and it just disappeared from the political scene. In 1970s, Justice Party was still prevailing, but Democratic Party was another alternative. It received good amount of votes, just like the New Turkey Party, and after the elections, it disappeared as well. 1970s is a period where there was a separation from the tradition of the Democrat Party, and the Milli Selamet Party was established, and one of them separated from the central right, and the other was separated from the central right towards a nationalist sentiment. In 1980s and 90s, after 12th of September, all of these parties were shut down. ANAP and DYP, DYP were the central rightist and parties, and in the left side we could see SHP and DSP. There was the Social Democrat People's Party, and it also received witnessed a transformation. And for the first time, SHP and DSP were divided into two. And in the years 2000, there was no coup. However, these parties just disappeared. And on the right side, we can see AK Party as the prevailing party, and there is MHP, but we can discuss about the position of MHP in a minute. On the left side, we see CHP and BDP. The BDP was a new formation back then. After this introduction, now I would like to talk about the amount of votes received by different parties during different elections. The voters who vote who have
geçerli seçmen diyebiliriz.
Valid votes, and these are the valid voters, in other words. So normally the number of people who are registered is even more than the amount of voters who are going to the ballot boxes and voting there. This was considered to be something passive for those who are not voting. If they're not going to vote, or they were not taken into consideration. This was how they were considered in the past. But I think they're assuming a more active position. So when the party when parties' votes are considered and evaluated, all of these should be taken into account as well. So how? Let's discuss about that. From 1950 to 2011, the letters are small, but I will be explaining them to you. This blue line represents the total voters on the right. Red is representing the number of votes on the leftist side, and this purple is representing the people who did not vote and who did not participate in the election. And this is somehow not categorized as a leftist or rightist. In the previous elections, these were representing the independent people, then HDP young people and the other parties, so the number increased towards 2000, and it is the tendency representing the people who cannot be categorized as leftist or the rightist. In 1950s, 10% was not participating in the elections. However, towards the 1960s, it was amounting to 40%, and it is even more in 1970s. So these are the areas when participating in the election was mandatory. That's why you see some decreases here. In the other periods, there is the freedom for voting, and that's why you can see such a high number of people who are not participating in the elections. When there is political turmoil, and if there is a problem of leadership in the party, the people prefer not to vote because they do not know who to vote. So the people who did not participate in the elections were not taken into consideration, and this created an illusion in the political literature. The rightist people are usually the ruling parties, and the leftist parties are the opposition parties in general terms. If the performance of the rightist party is low, the voters normally voting for the rightist party is voting for the leftist party. So we will be talking about that later on, saying that there is no such thing. And the people who did not vote, as you can see from the curve of the line, is mostly based and dependent on the performance of the rightist party. The ratio of the voters of the leftist party and its correlation with the people who are not voting is 0.9%, 92%. It is very high, and it is lower for the leftist party. So the voters are shifting from the ruling party to the opposition party, we said. If that was under the question, the correlation in between would be negative under normal conditions, of course. And it had to be significant. But there is no relation here. It is 0.3% or 0.03%. The blue line is representing the central right, and the red is representing the development and progression of rights other than the central right. So there is a correlation between these points, and it is 89%. So there is a shift of voters from the center to the other areas of right, because as of 2000 there is no central right. Instead, the right was divided, and the number of votes received by Democrat Party in 1950s or ANAP DYP votes in 1980s, which was close to 60%. All of them are representing the right, the marginal right.
Şimdi dediğimizi biraz daha açıklayalım. Önce şu sağdaki şekle bakarsak.
So if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, it just shows us the comparison of Democrat Party and CHP during the elections of 1950. In 1950, Democrat Party received more than 50% of the votes. It showed a better performance in 1954, and it was close to 60%. Then its performance diminished, and the number of votes decreased below 50%. And in the face of this, CHP was receiving 40% of the votes, and then in the face of its good performance, it lowered its performance and it received less of the votes, and then it improved its performance. So this is the figure comparing rights, left, and the ones who are protesting. So in 1950, the votes received by the rights was 50%, and it decreased, and it increased and decreased its number of votes. For the left, it was around 35%, and it decreased to 30%, and there was no increase. There was an increase in the number of people who protested the elections or who did not participate in the elections. So the correlation between the left party and the right party and the ones which did not participate in the election is very much in concordance. So the people just preferred not to vote for Democrat Party. Between 1960 and 80, during the elections, this is purple. This purple line shows us that the number of people who did not participate in the election increased, and the highest number was in the first election after the coup. And it was 39 in 1969, and in 1977, when there was a lot of participation and there were many parties, it was around 30%. So there is the Ecevit legend there, and Ecevit was set to be getting majority of the votes, but it was only 20%. And in 1977, he witnessed a very important increase in the number of votes. This is another illusion. So the left parties were not receiving many votes during the parliamentary elections, but receiving many votes in the local elections. So the people wanted to be governed by leftist people at the local level, but this was a very important propaganda until very recent times. In 1973, during the local or municipal elections, the level of participation was very low. In 1973, the level of participation was 53%, and in 1977, it was just 50%. In 1973, CHP received 42.4% of all votes, and in total was 20%. In 1977, the total percentage was 22%, and the proportion of the valid votes was 48%. So they were questioning whether why this was high in local elections but low in parliamentary elections, because the people were not participating, because there was no increase in the number of votes or in the number of supporters.
Biraz zor. 1980-2000 arasındaki seçimlerde ise
Between 1980 and 2000, central right left. The green represents the left, red marginal right, and the purple one is representing the people who cannot be categorized. We will be talking about that as well, why they cannot be categorized. In 1983 and 87 elections, central right had many votes. It's a bit high here. It was my mistake. I mean, the red line is a bit high in 1983 elections. However, it is my mistake, and under normal conditions, you should be seeing it coming from the bottom. In 1999 elections, the marginal right received a high amount of votes, and there are ups and downs in the left. And after 1995 elections, there are some divisions on the left side, and ethnic politics is stepping in the foreground. It is interesting as well, and it is representing the Kurdish people. It should be on the side. However, this is coming from within CHP. It is also a complex matter as well. From 1991 to 1999, there is an increase, and approximately 17 or 18% of voters cannot find a place in this political picture, and they're not voting. This is, I think, a figure that we can confide in, because this can be expected in all kinds of elections, and this was low in the past because it was mandatory to participate in the elections back then.
Şimdi sağın 95'te
So the rise of the right in 95 brings this dramatic picture into being, actually. The right was in the margins, amalgamated under one umbrella under RP, Refah Party. And three parties actually was embraced by RP, and the results in 1994 came to being. Istanbul, Ankara, Konya, you see the green color, Kayseri, Erzurum, Diyarbakır were lost to RP. These are big cities. And Izmir, for example, Eskişehir and Antalya, today they are in the hands of the CHP, but then in 1994 they were DYP. And ANAP, İçel, Adana, Bursa voted for ANAP, SHP, and you can see the purple shades. So this is how the picture started changing in early 90s. Actually, in starting 1995. This is the central right, the blue line. Left, the red line, and the green line is the off-center right trends. So the trend lines you see, the central right has going down, and actually in 2011 it was almost lost, extinct. Left is continuing with its downward trend, and the right, marginal right, is, or off-center right, is on the rise. And this gives us a glimpse of our expectations for future elections. A right party is coming to the government, and left will weaken and weaken. But why? As a social category, why? Is it because of the birth rates in the... No, of course. Just like the Kurdish minority separating themselves from the left will break down in its own constituents. For example, there will be maybe in the future a Kemalist leftist party or a party of the Alawites or a third party who will not accept anyone apart from Kemalists, for example. These are just possibilities that will lead to decreasing numbers or lead to the continuation of this downward trend of the left. And after the two previous presentations, my forecast is a bit rough in comparison to theirs, but I think it is a bit clear in a sense that the right party is coming for the highest votes. It might be AKP or whatever the name is, and the left will continue as a weakening or a waning opposition, and that will be all. Thank you.
Geliyor mu siz? İbrahim Bey'e teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for the presentation. We have listened to 3 presentations, and let's have a quick question and answer session. Please just introduce yourselves, and please be brief as possible with your questions. You please, and please tell us who you are asking the question to. My first question to Ibrahim Dalmış, actually. This question I asked to Ibrahim Uslu on Twitter about 30th of March, when the election results will go public. What's the picture that awaits us? The nationwide picture, which will correspond to almost 70-75% of the national results, covering metropolitan municipalities and city councils. And how will the votes will be calculated? How will the votes will be distributed among parties? And also Ibrahim Bey, but which Ibrahim Bey? Ibrahim Uslu this time. While I was on my way here in Diyarbakir, there was an announcement by Abdullah Öcalan, and it was on the radio. And Abdullah Öcalan considers this election as a new Castilian, as the start of a new Castilian period, and a coup against himself. In Mersin, Adana, there is a vote, BDP vote, from the Kurdish voters, around 6 to 7%, and these voters focus in Adana, Mersin, and would this explanation by Abdullah Öcalan have an impact on the behavior of the voters in these big cities, Adana and Mersin? And another question, Saliha Kaya. I come from SETA, and I wish to address Ali Bey. During elections, there will be some postponements of inflation, and there will be some promises by the political parties. I think the current deficit is another big problem, apart from the inflation and the current deficit, and this has become a balloon, almost a balloon, in the last 3 elections. And don't you think it will blast somewhere in time? Ibrahim Uslu, you consider the upcoming elections as a general elections, and AKP votes are close to the votes that it will get in the general elections, but still by 0.7 it is the farthest to the average. And CHP average was, I think, higher in your results. According to those results, the results of your study, you think AKP, can you say AKP has come up with the wrong names as nominees for mayors? I will be addressing Ali Akarca. Growth increases votes, and decreases inflation, but still the inflation is following a downward trend in Turkey recently. Could you explain this? About growth and the trade-off between growth and inflation. So let's follow the original line of speakers. Well, commercial or trade deficit. Inflation and growth has an impact on votes. Yes, I said that, but I didn't mean to say that the voters consider these numbers. They are almost illiterate in this regard. Everybody considers his own or her own pocket, so to speak, how the sales are going, how are people doing. That's it. I need those figures to come up with statistical data as academicians. So, the deficit, if the current deficit has an impact, the voters don't know about it. When the impact is seen, only then the voters can react against it, but I don't believe that the current deficit is a problem. The United States of America, for example, has lived with a current account deficit for about a century. Then there is a surplus until 1975, and since 1975 their current deficit exists. It's like a running man with a high heart rate. But if you are just lying down, resting position, and still your heart rate is up, then there is a problem. This is investment. The same thing happens in Turkey. There is current deficit in America because Kuwait flows in investments, or they bring in money. They buy deeds, for example, stock shares, and they buy property, etc. And the same thing happens in Turkey, and it's also natural that it leads up to current account deficit. That's one. The second thing, current account deficit, does it belong to the companies or the state? Definitely not the state. And about the inflation, I just couldn't understand that. Actually, I mean, the inflation goes down and it has lesser negative impact. What's the question about inflation, actually? You're asking about the impact of inflation. Why does it have an impact? Well, when there is high inflation, the consumers will react negatively against it. There was a negative coefficient in your presentation. Yes, the voters don't like inflation, they like growth, and it was around 0.6. But if you have 5% of inflation and your income will rise by 0.1, they are okay with it. So, not only in Turkey, the voters like growth, and depending on the rate of growth, they can live with inflation. And our voters are no different than the voters in Europe or in US. Well, I have come across people saying that our voters are stupid, they're not clever voters like US voters. No, there's another columnist who claims otherwise. Both are clever, both are no different than one another. The question was about BDP and the shift of votes from BDP to AKP in Adana and in Mersin. After the 17th of December, after the operations, Öcalan has made a couple of announcements which went public, and he retains his stance, his position. But still, since then, at least in big cities, in cities where he does not stand a chance of winning elections, we have not seen any floating votes. And for BDP, I must say, the loyalty of the voters is so firm. This never happened, the floating votes, the shifting of votes, and it won't happen after this point. They need a long, exhaustive propaganda to do that, and the vote floating between CHP and MHP, for example, it exists. But this just doesn't happen just like that. It's not the voters just sit down and think to themselves, let me think strategically, and I will this time go vote not for CHP but MHP. That's not the behavior of the voters. They don't vote so strategically, at least between BDP and AKP. The same thing doesn't apply for between CHP and MHP, but we don't expect any floating votes from BDP to AKP. And about the wrong nominees for mayors by AKP, that was the second portion of the question. Let me remind you the difference of votes. Maybe you couldn't see it on the screen. General elections and local elections, the difference of votes for AKP is just 0.7. It's not even 1. The same thing goes for CHP by 0.6 and 0.5 for MHP, 0.4 for BDP. So this tells us for all of the parties the difference between the votes for local and general elections, it's even less than 1%. So it has nothing to do with picking up the right or wrong faces as local governors. And also, of course, there are differences between our forecasts, and we have some room for mistakes, of course, as pollsters. And these differences are so normal. But it seems that this table shows us that there won't be big differences between the votes in the general elections and local elections, and the voters will be behaving as if, or voting as if they're voting for the general elections this time still.
YSK'da bir açıklama yapmadı. Bana uygun.
And the High Council of Elections didn't make any explanations. Well, people will be voting for district municipalities, for metropolitan municipalities, and also for district municipal councils. And in normal cities, there are city councils as well. And I think district councils and city councils will be added, the numbers of votes for these two sections, and that's how the calculation will be made, I think, but I don't know. I don't know. As I said, YSK, the High Council of Elections, didn't make any announcements so far about the calculation. We can have a second round of questions, I guess.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jasper Mortimer. I'm with France 24 Television. Two quick questions. Firstly, to Ibrahim Uslu. From your polling, when you look at the three biggest cities of Turkey, in which city do you see the incumbent most likely to lose? And secondly, to the whole panel, could you tell us something about the likelihood of irregularities on March the 30th? Previously, I've always thought that Turkish elections have been impressively clean, that votes have been counted as cast. But people are telling me now the government has its back to the wall and some funny things might happen in the vote counting centre. And what happened in Parliament this week when the votes were tallied twice and each time there was a different total doesn't give one a lot of confidence. Thank you.
Soruyla devam edeceğiz. Evet.
Let's respond to the question. In the three biggest cities of Turkey, we're not, in Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, we're not expecting any changes. And the mayors, the incumbent mayors, will win again in the elections. We're not expecting any surprises in Istanbul and in Izmir. distance between the first and the second parties is big, and it won't close up in the upcoming term. In Ankara, that distance between the two parties is less. But in the last 45 days, I think it has come to a standstill, meaning that the voter behavior has crystallized. We're not expecting any changes again in the last, not even in the last week, not even in the last minute. I don't think there will be a change, a sudden change. And about the second question, I think this is just propaganda. All parties are putting in great effort to ensure that to ensure transparency for all, for the entire election process, bringing in international observers, etc. So the election will take place in a transparent environment, and I think the votes that are cast will be represented. And everybody's doing their best about this to ensure this. And the parties are using advanced technologies to monitor the entire process, and nobody stands a chance to rig anything, so to speak. And the voting is not done, elections is not done under the supervision of the government, but the justice. And entry into the databases is done, entry of votes is done by hand of the judiciary, and if any problems will come up in the end, it won't be the mistake of any parties, but it will be the problem that the election councils must grapple with. So I don't expect any irregularities in the elections, and I don't think that the political parties stand a chance of performing any irregularities at the ballot. And all the parties will have their representatives there, will have their lawyers standing watch there, and the elections won't be different than previous elections, meaning that it will be as clean and as transparent as possible. For example, there were some a couple of years ago, some recent arrangements, regulations that were introduced about the transparency of the elections, so I'm not expecting any surprises. Let me clarify a couple of issues. Ibrahim Bey actually made a brief, beautiful historical remark. In 1950, DP, Democrat Party, has taken 50% of the votes and taken more of that in 54, and then came the military coup, and there were a couple of emerging new parties, fledgling parties, and the votes have receded back to 50%. Again, when it evolved into AP, this time Justice Party, and in 12th of March there was another coup, and the votes were scattered again, and AP has received again 50% of the votes around 70s, and then the votes were scattered again in the 80s after the military coup, and in 2012 the votes have flocked together again, but scattered again immediately after the elections because the political parties were banned in 1980s. So the liberal economic thinking, conservative and religious or pious parties have this inclination to flock together. And also about people who protest, who don't vote. We have made a study actually about this for 2011 elections. There are some issues that we're overlooking. A generation gap, for example. In 2011 elections, in 2011, in a city, you have a lot of people, for example, above the age of 60, and then you have high amount of votes, and young people are the ones who vote less. That's the generation gap I'm talking about. The voters, real voters, are the ones who are actually above the age of 60. They're not the old ones. They are the baby boomers, actually, who were born before 50s. The same thing goes for Turkey. The same thing goes for US. But then in the generations that follow the baby boomers, you see that decrease in the amount of votes. And that's the reason why you have lesser votes in the 80s and 90s and so forth. And it is again going up, started going up. And also there are cities taking migration and giving out migration, which has an effect in the number of members of the parliament. Istanbul, for example, houses many Black Sea people, and that's how people vote. When you have a lot of people from the Black Sea who have migrated to Istanbul from the Black Sea, they vote to people they know. And also another thing, these elections will be no different than general elections, although it is actually the local elections. And also he said, Ibrahim Uslu has said, what happened after 17th of December won't have an impact. For example, in 1999 there was an earthquake, and grafting happened again during the earthquake, and that had an impact on elections, and we studied that actually, but we came up with the conclusion that the corruption or grafting per se has no impact on the votes. Maybe 2%, 3% votes are lost, but still the main factor is the economy, the main factor is growth. But there are cases where corruption has an impact. It's not that the voters don't know about corruption or grafts. They know, for example, a certain mayor to be a thief, plainly a thief, but they still vote for them. For example, in Brazil, in order to prevent corruption, they put all the votes for all municipalities under the auspices of the notary public, and that's how they make the elections, and investigators are there, and still the mayors, who are known to be thieves, plain thieves, can still win in the elections, and there is a logic behind this. What matters, actually, what people who are outside of the AKP think is of no significance, is of no importance. There are some people that you need some people who won't vote for AKP, and that won't happen. So what happens after 17th of December, I'm trying to say, has no effect on the voters and the loyal voters of AKP. But if economy is bad, if government is bad, and that's what happened in 2002, in 1999, for example, by 1999, all of the parties, apart from MHP and DSP, had been tried. People have been voting for different parties, different coalitions of parties, except DSP and MHP, and they have had their chance in the government. And then in 1999 came the elections, and in a region where they have no municipalities, but after the earthquake, corruption erupted. And even if they didn't have a hand, the two parties didn't have a hand in the corruption, it was not their incapability, and they didn't meddle with Susurluk and other corruption cases, but still AKP emerged as the winner in that environment. So in order for corruption or rigging or grafting to have an impact, you need to have the other side as the clean alternative. Voters should think, I will vote for this one or this one, which is more clean. That's the only way. Plus, what's the alternative of AKP? It's not a single party government, it's just a coalition. And when you have coalition, you have And actually, that's a question. Do you have more or less corruption in coalitions? The answer is evident, and coalitions are no clean alternatives to single-party governments.
Tur yapabiliriz.
We may have the last tour of questions. Very briefly, please, because we have very limited time. Orhan Savas. I would like to ask a question to Ibrahim Uslu. You talked about 71% of loyal voters, and when we look at the 20 percentile and 9 percentile section, so we talked about some corruption and the shutting down of the Twitter, of course, leaving them aside, the fragmentation within AK Party and the damaging of religious sensations and sentiments as heard in the phone recordings. Do you think they are influential on the tendency of the voters? I was going to ask a question about corruption, but I understand that it is not very much influential. But the steps taken towards banning the technology may have an impact on the young people. That's my question. Is it influential on young people? I am trying to look at the diagnostics in this model. In the independent variables, T statistics seem to be significant. However, maybe it was amongst the diagnostics of the model. I'm not sure, because it is like 42 to 47 in the 95 confidence interval, isn't it? So it is estimated amount. Yes, my question is, so the diagnostics of the model, do they show that it's a quality model? Yes, it has many different things. So it is in line with the model. So when you make estimations, there are three mistakes, and they're inevitable. One of them is that you are estimating for a small elections, the parameter. The parameters may be wrong. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the inflation rates and the growth rates should be included there. But right now, we do not know the growth rate and the inflation rate, because, as I told you, remember, the last 1 year is important, but we just have the data from the past 6 months. So we do not have any figure regarding growth rate and inflation rate in the last quarter of 2013. So my assumption is that it is going to continue as it is in the first half of 2013. So when we add the numbers as such, so it can diminish. So the last variable, which is the room for mistake, let's say that there was a force majeure and there was this earthquake, and you cannot foresee it beforehand. So even if you write down and formulate the best model, or a meteor may strike, may hit the earth, so you cannot estimate it beforehand. Very briefly, some things are very new. Therefore, we do not know the effect of those new developments on the behavior of the voters. For example, the mocking of the religious sentiments, for example, we do not know its influence. But the important thing is that whether this people is representing AK Party and where he stands in AK Party, because similar things happened in the past, and the voters just ignored it, and they never gave up supporting that party because they believe that he is not or she is not supporting the whole of the party, the entire party. The second thing is about restriction of freedom in terms of access to technology and intervention to free lifestyle. Those people are not voting for AKP right from the beginning of the process. But since Gezi protests, the movement of voters is on a horizontal scale, according to certain pollsters. So, and some other pollsters are having the same opinion with us, are agreeing with us. So these may be right and true allegations. However, is important at the end of the day is that to what extent it is representing the entire party and how it changes the behavior of the voters. So people who are voting for AK Party think that this is not true. And even if they think that they are true, they have more influential factors for themselves for voting AKP. For example, the healthcare sector, the service sector, or its performance in the international arena or in the domestic arena. So these are more important factors for them rather than the other restrictions that the party impose. After these three presentations, I don't know to what extent the professors are aware, however, many mediatic cliches have been destroyed by them, have been falsified by them. It is not only something peculiar to 30th of March elections, but they also gave some overall information, general information regarding the analysis of the results of the elections. And they also talked about the calculation methods and observation methods, and even asking questions. So there's nothing miraculous here. So you saw the presentations. The same things are done by different media organizations and the political parties. But it seems like there are very different results and answers to the questions posed to the professors. So we know, I mean, the important thing is that how media uses them. Of course, on 30th of March, the supervision and inspection and their results are going to be seen and observed. But I think as a product of this meeting, we can say that considering the things that we have been living through since for the past 2.5 months, right after 5 or 6 months after these elections, the presidential elections are going to be carried out, and we're going to see whether the results of this election will have some reflections and implications on that as well. So I would like to thank you for your participation. I would like to thank the panelists for their participation and effort.